Out in small-town rural Texas, there are old forgotten homesteads with long, often ancient pasts. When one family takes advantage of a cheap piece of land and moves out there, they discover something that was left behind and promptly remove it. It does not take long for them to realize it was there for a very important reason. This story is called The Red Circle and was sent to me anonymously. Every house has a history, and sometimes history repeats itself. The asking price should have told me everything. 40 acres and a 3-bedroom ranch house in Terrell County, Texas. For a figure I'd have expected to pay for a used SUV with cosmetic damage. I checked the title 3 times for liens, pulled the tax history, ran the parcel number through every database my work credentials could access. The property was clean. I assumed, as anyone would, that the remoteness accounted for the price. Sanderson is 2.5 hours from the nearest city that qualifies for a city, and even then the city is Odessa, which qualifies only technically. We moved in at the end of summer. The heat was the kind that makes you feel personally disliked by the sky. Renee sat in the passenger seat with her sunglasses on, not talking, which I'd learned from 11 years of marriage could mean she was angry or tired or simply finished with the day's conversation before it even started. Lily slept in her car seat, face red and damp with her mouth open, looking like a small drunk. Cody had his headphones on, watching something on the tablet. The dogs were in the back of the truck, pressed flat on the bed, ears pinned by wind. The house appeared on the horizon slowly, like the land was still deciding whether to let us see it. First the roofline, then the walls, then the scrub yard and the leaning fence posts. It looked like something a child would draw if you asked them to draw a house, and they were only being half honest about it. The proportions weren't quite right. Additions had been made to the original structure at least twice, and whoever did the work had not worried much about matching materials or maintaining the roofline. The eastern side of the house sat slightly higher than the western side. I loved it immediately, though. I know how that sounds. Renee looked at it and took her sunglasses off, then put them back on, saying, "Okay." That was the tone she used when she decided she would survive something, to tolerate it. But I had wanted land since I was a boy, sharing a wall with a family of 5 in a San Antonio apartment complex. Back then, the hallways always smelled of pine sol and cooking grease. 40 acres was more land than anyone in my family had ever touched. The size of the sky out there made my chest feel loose for the first time in years. The silence, which Renee would later call aggressive, felt to me like the first clean breath after years of breathing through a cloth. The Starlink dish went up on the roof the second week. I'd done the coverage check before we made the offer. Without it, I had nothing. My contract work required a stable connection, and my clients didn't care that I'd moved to a place where cell service arrived and departed with the mood of the atmosphere. The landline in the kitchen worked, technically, but it hummed with static when the wind blew, which was almost always. And the sound it made when you held the receiver to your ear was like someone pressing their mouth very close to a microphone and breathing. I found the line on the 6th day, while walking the perimeter of the house, looking for foundation cracks. The slab had settled unevenly. A hairline fracture ran along the southeast corner, and I'd been following it with my finger when I noticed a band of red on the ground about 40 feet out from the wall. A mineral deposit of some sort, I thought. Some oxidized stripe in the caliche. But I followed it, and it curved. And that curve went on and on, bending around the house in a rough circle. It was thick and uneven, painted directly onto the hardpan. It was red like the floor of a mechanic's garage, painted over with a safety zone. When I crouched and scratched at it with my boot heel, it came up in layers, one shade of red over another over another. Someone had painted this circle many times. The oldest layers had faded to the color of dried blood on a bandage. The top coat was newer, maybe 5 or 6 years old, but the sun and wind had started on it. I told Renee about it over dinner. She asked if it was something to do with septic drainage. I said probably. Then Cody asked if it was a pentagram that was never finished. Boy, just eat your chicken, I said. Lily ignored the conversation entirely, feeding a piece of broccoli to the dog under the table. The dog accepted it without enthusiasm, which was unusual for that dog. Renee asked me to get rid of it on the second weekend. She had been walking the yard with Lily, looking for a place to put a garden box, and that line was starting to bother her. It looks like someone was trying to keep something out, she said, then laughed, but only with her mouth. I agreed that it was ugly. I'd been planning to pressure wash the porch anyway, so I dragged the hose out, working my way around the circle over the course of one afternoon. The paint came up easily enough under the spray. The water cut through it and turned the soil dark, and the dark soil dried almost immediately in the heat, as if the ground was thirsty enough to drink it before I could finish a section. By 4 o'clock, the line was gone and the ground looked clean. I felt satisfied. Being a new homeowner with control over your own property has that effect. That night, the dogs barked from 10 in the evening until nearly 3 in the morning, then stopped at the same moment, both of them mid-bark, like a recording that had been switched off. The silence after that was worrying. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle and tick. I tried to tell myself that the quality of the darkness in the room was the same as it had been every night so far. But I knew it wasn't. It was thicker that night. It had something to it I could only describe as attentive, which is not a good word to describe darkness. But that dark that night, it felt loaded or pressurized. The sky outside was clear and full of stars, and the stars looked very far away. In the morning, I was astonished. Every door in our house had been opened. Interior doors, cabinet doors, the oven and the dishwasher, the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, that little door on the front of the dryer where you clean the lint trap. Every single thing that could be opened had been opened, and everything stood wide. Renee asked if I'd done it. I asked if she had. Then we asked the kids. Cody said no, and he seemed offended that we would ask him that. Lily was eating cereal and didn't answer. Then again, she was only 4. Cereal was way more interesting than some question. We closed everything and moved on with our day. We had just uprooted our lives for a dream I'd been carrying since childhood, and closing some doors and moving on was the best option that we had to help us keep going. I think we settled on sleeping through some sort of earthquake, a small one that can open some doors and leave things ajar. Yeah, maybe it was cope. The next few nights I slept badly. I didn't have nightmares in the traditional sense. What I did have was this feeling. I would wake up at some odd hour in the night, and I'd feel like someone had just been standing beside the bed and had taken a single step backward the instant my eyes began to open. The feeling was so specific and so physical that I would lie still and listen for breathing that wasn't mine or Renee's. But I would hear nothing, even though that feeling of not being alone in our room persisted. Then Renee started to find her things moved. Her keys were in the freezer. Her phone was in the mailbox at one point at the end of our driveway, which was a 1/4 mile from our house. She found her reading glasses in Lily's toy bin, folded neatly and placed on top of a stuffed rabbit. She blamed the kids, and it kinda did make the most sense, because otherwise how do things like that wind up where they did? It was either the kids or the world's dumbest burglar. I watched her face when she said it was the kids, and I could see she didn't fully believe it. But I also could see that I think we all needed to believe it, so I didn't go against her on that. Before long, the smell started. It came in around the second week. Pretty faint at the start of it, and I mean genuinely faint. I wasn't sure it was even real until I smelled it in 2 separate rooms on the same evening. I would describe it as sulfur-like, cut with something earthy and flowery, like water left at the bottom of a flower pot. A nursery school teacher I'd known as a kid kept a vase like that on her desk for an entire semester, refilling the water but never changing the flowers. And by April, the classroom had that same sour, sweet rot, organic decay, something floral underneath, neither disguising the other. That was the smell. I noticed the smell was strongest in our hallway, the one that ran from the bedrooms to the kitchen in a straight line, about 30 feet if I had to guess. During the day it was just a hallway, but at night it felt longer than it actually was. I know it sounds like a metaphor when I say it, but I'm not meaning it as a metaphor, but literally. Like when I walked from the bedroom to the kitchen at 2 a.m., the hallway seemed to contain more space than it did during the day. The walls seemed farther apart. The ceiling seemed higher. The bathroom door, which I could normally reach in 6 steps from our bedroom, took 8 or 9 steps, and I would arrive at the kitchen winded, disoriented, unsure of how long I'd been walking. Of course, a guy like me, I had to measure it. I'm a man who works with structured data, and I measured the hallway at 2 p.m. and again at 2 a.m. with the same tape measure, and I got the same number both times, 31 feet and 4 inches. Well, I guess that number meant nothing. The hallway didn't care what the tape measure said. I knew there was no way the sizes were the same. Around the same time, I found the marks on the doors. I noticed them first on the back door, which I used every morning to let out the dogs. 4 vertical scratches in the paint, running from chest height down to the handle. They were deeper than my fingernail when I ran my finger across it. But it didn't look like an animal had done it. It almost looked like a man or person had. But who scratches their own door? I didn't think either me or Renee would do it, and the kids didn't have the strength to leave marks like that. The front door had them as well, same height and spacing, drawn down the wood with a steady, even pressure from top to bottom. The hand that made them did not vary and did not seem to tire. I checked the door in the garage. 4 scratches. The frame of the window above the kitchen sink. 4 scratches. The sill of the window in Cody's room on the outside, which I could only see by leaning out over the frame. 4 scratches. Fresh enough that the curls of stripped paint still clung to the wood. Not long after that, the dogs stopped going outside. They had been reluctant since the night we washed the line, but now they flat out refused. They'd stand at the back door when I opened it, looking out at the yard with their ears flat and bodies low. When I saw their tails pressed between their legs so tightly their tails trembled, I knew something was wrong. If I stepped out and called at them, they would whine and back up instead. They slept in the kitchen, huddled so close together with each other under the table. And during the day, they followed Renee from room to room, desperately seeking her attention. Those dogs had decided that they were her dogs, and Renee had never had a say in the matter. Our older dog, a shepherd mix named Dutch, developed a habit of staring at the hallway from the kitchen threshold. He would sit there for hours with his head slightly lowered, watching the corridor. And if anyone walked through the hallway, he would track them with his eyes. I could see the fur along his spine lift and settle and lift again. What was he looking for, I wondered. One night during the second week, I got up to get some water. The hallway was doing that thing again, where it seemed to be stretched out. I walked it slowly. My legs felt stiff, and the air in the corridor had that quality again of thickness and not being alone. And unsurprisingly, the smell was back. I was passing Cody's door, when I heard something outside the house, a sound that I initially processed as the wind. You see, the wind is always blowing out there, so you learn to subtract it from everything else you hear. But this sound had a regularity to it that wind doesn't have, a sort of rhythm. Something was circling the house. I could hear it in the gravel and scrub on the north side, a soft crunching evenly paced. Then it moved to the east side. The sound continued at the same tempo, then the south, and then the west, then the north again, a full circuit. Whatever was making the sound was walking the perimeter of the house in a circle, which happened to match the path where the red line used to be. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to it complete 3 circuits. On the 3rd circuit, it stopped on the western side, directly outside the wall of Lily's bedroom. There was silence then, for perhaps 30 seconds. Then a low, resonant hum, nearly below the range of hearing, but I could feel it slowly traveling through my bones. It stopped, and the wind was just the wind again. I went back to bed, confused. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, feeling exhausted inside and out. I forced myself to sleep before I could think too much about things. Lily began to talk to someone around the 3rd week. I heard it through the wall of her bedroom. She would talk and pause as if waiting for someone to reply, then talk again. Here and there would be little laughs and short answers. I went in her room, asking her who she was talking to. "The sad man," she said. She was sitting on her bed with a crayon in one hand and a coloring book open to a page of farm animals. She hadn't colored inside any of the lines. "Where's the sad man, sweetheart?" "He's in the wall. He says he used to live here and he misses somebody." "Okay, what else does he say?" "Well, he says you washed away his work and that it was important." She sounded like she was scolding me, then went right back to coloring, filling in a horse with a blue crayon. She was 4 and the conversation was over for her. No amount of standing in the doorway was going to reopen that conversation. I put my hand on the frame, and I felt the wood. It just felt like wood. But hearing her say what she said was yet another thing that was making this house feel more alive. The wall she'd pointed at was the western wall. It faced the yard, and beyond the yard, the shed. Now, I should tell you about the shed. It sat around 80 yards from the house, closer to the western fence line. It was built from cinder blocks with a corrugated metal roof. It didn't have any windows. The door was a heavy wooden slab, a single thick piece that did not match anything you'd buy at a hardware store. And a padlock held it shut, rusted to the color and texture of a scab that had been picked at and reformed many times. I told my kids to stay away from that thing. The structure looked unsound, and that was true. But over time, it was also true that the shed was making me feel uneasy, just like the rest of the house. Speaking of the house, it showed its age honestly. Cracked caulk, sun-bleached paint, wasp nests everywhere, and sand tended to drift into every seam and corner. That desert had been weathering the house for 60 years. The house clearly bore those wounds, but the shed did not. The roof wasn't rusted through, and the cinder blocks were not crumbling. The mortar between them looked almost recent, in fact. It sat out there in the scrub, kept and tended to by no one I could see, and I had not gone inside it because I had not wanted to. I was busy with the house, my family, my Starlink, and my contracts. I cut the padlock with bolt cutters on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after we moved in, 2 days after Lily started talking to the wall, or rather the sad man. The lock resisted and then gave with a brittle crack, like breaking a stick of chalk. The door swung inward on hinges that moved a little too smoothly. Inside, there was a single room, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a concrete floor swept so clean that the broom marks were still visible in the dust, parallel lines running corner to corner. A wooden table was pushed against the back wall, and the surface was covered in ring marks from mugs and cans, and what looked like candle wax, layered and scraped and relayered over years. The air inside was cool and still, which made no sense for a cinder block box in the West Texas sun. It should have been a baking oven in there. Instead, the air had a damp chill to it, like a cellar would, and the coolness seemed to rise from beneath the floor. On the table and on shelves made from planks and cinder blocks, I found what the previous owner had left behind: an old Coleman lantern with a cracked mantle. There was also a plastic jug, empty, that still smelled faintly of kerosene. There were several mason jars filled with a coarse white substance that I later determined was salt. There was also a coffee can packed with dried sage, brittle and gray. Then I found the notebooks. His name was Harlan Cull. The name had been written inside the cover of the first notebook, where he wrote it in block letters alongside a date: September 2004. There were maybe a dozen of these notebooks, the cheap composition kind with the marbled black and white covers. They reminded me of the ones I'd use in middle school for vocabulary lists. They were filled front to back in handwriting that began small and controlled, but progressively fell apart over what I estimated to be several years of entries. I read through the notebooks over the course of 3 evenings, sitting at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, while Renee watched TV in the living room, the hallway between us doing its trick of feeling stretched. What I pieced together from that information was this: Harlan moved to the property after his wife died. He chose the isolation, but something started to happen almost right away, and his early entries described it: doors open in the morning, objects displaced, that smell in the hallway, and sounds at night, specifically what he called a breathing in the walls, which he initially thought was pipes or wind. The entries changed over the first year. The precise and careful handwriting eroded. He began repeating the same observations, writing them down again and again, as if he was trying desperately not to forget, or to remind himself. He tried salt, then sage, then a priest from Alpine who came once, performed something, and never returned. Harlan wrote about calling the diocese 3 times afterward, but he was told that the priest was unavailable. He tried sealing the doors with weather stripping, and he tried sleeping in the shed at times. One time he tried to leave. He drove 40 miles toward Fort Stockton before turning around because, and I quote, "It's worse to know it's here and not be watching it." Ugh, that line gave me chills. Then he found the books. They were still on the shelves when I opened the shed. 3 of them, cheaply printed and dense, perfectly bound, like small academic press-run books. The titles seemed to be in Latin and English, and the publishers were names I'd never seen before and could not find when I searched for them later. One of them had a chapter marked with a strip of electrical tape, and that chapter described a category of entity that attached to grief. That entity does not arrive, the book said. It accretes. It builds itself from the particular energy of a person who has lost someone they loved and cannot, in some fundamental interior place, release them. The grief becomes material. It accumulates, slowly, and eventually reaches a kind of critical mass. That's when it becomes conscious, and that's when it starts to want things. It wants doors, it wants a body, it wants to dissolve the boundaries between spaces, between inside and outside, between the living and the dead, and whatever else there might be. The line was Harlan's answer. In one of the later notebooks, He described finding the instructions in one of the books. The language he used was a declared perimeter, which he described as a boundary maintained by active human intention. Paint it on the ground, renew it regularly, walk it daily, and keep it watched. The entity could not cross it as long as someone was choosing to enforce it. The moment attention lapsed, the moment the paint faded and no one repainted it, that boundary became abstract, and abstract boundaries meant nothing to that thing in the walls. Harlan maintained the line for what I calculated to be 15 years, from approximately 2004 to his death in 2019. His notebooks were filled with the maintenance of that line, about which sections faded the fastest and how weather affected coverage. He even described what happened the one time he let a section go thin. A single entry from November 2014 that read, "The south side, rain washed the paint. It got through. I will not let that happen again." There were no details about what "got through" actually meant, and that lack of detail was what really troubled me, because I kept thinking about what that could mean. Harlan died in the house, sitting in a kitchen chair facing the front door. I found his obituary in the online archive of a paper I'd never heard of. 3 sentences saying, "Longtime resident, no surviving family, private services." Driven entirely by curiosity, I began to pull some data. My work credentials gave me access to title search databases. I ran the parcel number and pulled the chain of ownership. The property had changed hands 6 times since 1979. Average stay, 3 to 4 years. One family lasted just 8 months. I found a gap between 1981 and 1986, during which the county held the title, and a note in the digital record said, "Structure condemned," though no condemnation report was attached, and the house had clearly been reoccupied after that. The pattern looked, to someone like me, like a recurring error in a system, the same input producing the same failed output, over and over, but no one ever fixing it. In a scan of a county assessor's file, I found a photograph. It was a Polaroid, uploaded at low resolution, which depicted the house taken from a distance. The image was poor, but I could see the red line on the ground, faded and splotchy, but unmistakably the same circle. The metadata on the scan said the original photo was dated 1983 on the back, so the line had been there 20 years before Harlan Cole even arrived. Harlan never created the first line. He had just found it, just as I had found it. But he recognized it for what it was, or learned what it was, and he restored it, took care of it, until he died in a kitchen chair facing the front door. I realized that was the only door he could watch from that position. That man had probably been sitting there watching for 15 years. Over those days that I read all of this, I couldn't believe it. I believed that Harlan Cole was a lonely man who had lost his wife, so he came to the desert and slowly disassembled in the heat and the solitude. The notebooks were some sort of record of a mind turning in on itself, struggling to cope with trauma and loneliness, building a mythology around the ordinary creaks and smells of an old house. Despite how creepy these books and notebooks were, this is what I believed. Until the night I stopped in the hallway outside Lily's room at 2:47 a.m., and I once again heard her talking. Her half of the conversation was simple. Those short sentences that 4-year-olds do. "Okay. Why? That's silly." And then she laughed, a real good laugh. But after she was done laughing, I heard it through the wall. A sound at the lowest edge of my hearing, more vibration than voice. There was someone in there with my daughter. I opened the door. Lily was sitting up in bed, facing the western wall. the one she said the sad man was in. She turned to look at me, and her face did something. For perhaps half a second, she looked at me with an expression that did not belong to my daughter. She looked older than she actually was, and angry, like I'd interrupted something important. A flicker of irritation and authority, which could not come from my child. It crossed her features and was gone. In the same suddenness, she was Lily again, small and sleepy. She said to me, "Daddy, I was talking." Then she lay back down and closed her eyes. I stood in the doorway and put my hand on the western wall. It was warm. The rest of the house was cool. The AC had been running all evening, and the hallway air had that dry, conditioned chill to it. But that wall was warm. Something inside that wall was giving off its own heat. Something alive and resting just behind the sheetrock where my daughter slept every night. I would be repainting the line the next morning. I drove to Fort Stockton, as Sanderson doesn't have a hardware store. An hour each way. I bought 4 cans of red exterior paint, the cheapest kind. I mean, from what I saw, Harlan also used cheap paint, and I wasn't about to improve upon the methods of a man who kept this thing contained for 15 years. I started at the point on the north side, where I could still see the faintest trace of the old line. A discoloration of the caliche that was invisible unless you knew it was there. I painted the full circle in one afternoon. The paint went down easily enough, soaking into the ground, and I worked steadily. My wife probably saw me bent at the waist with a brush and the sun bearing down on my neck. When I was finished, I stood at the edge of the circle and looked back at the house, which now sat once more within a red perimeter, and I felt relief. Like a problem had been solved, sort of like I dodged a bullet. That night, every door in the house stayed closed. The dogs went outside for the first time in a week and lay in the yard, sleeping. The hallway was 31 feet and 4 inches long and actually felt that way all day long. And I was able to sleep through the night for the first time since we'd arrived. Nothing woke me up out of nowhere. I woke instead to the ordinary heat of a Texas morning, and the quietness and peace outside was the good kind. The house finally felt like just a house. This lasted 10 days. I checked that line every morning. I walked the full perimeter as Harlan had, looking for cracks, maybe some fading, or places where wind-blown sand was beginning to cover the paint. I found some, and when I did, I would touch them up. The desert weathers down everything. The wind will file paint down grain by grain, and the sun will bleach it, and the sand will just cover it. Given enough time, it would erase this whole circle, in some way. And whatever lay beyond the line, well, I was sure it had all the time in the world. I began to think of the maintenance, something I had not planned for to live out here. This would from now on require my daily attention, or it would fail again, like it was some roof or fence needing patched. But as stressful as it sounded, I soon realized I didn't mind the work. The mornings were nice. I'd always been a morning person. The light came in gold from the east, and the air was cool still before being warmed up by the sun, and it smelled of creosote and dust. I would walk the circle with my brush and can, and I felt, for about half an hour each day, important and satisfied. It kind of reminded me of my database work, building a clean schema. The line was a kind of query. It asked the desert a question every day, and the answer so far was the right one. Again, during those 10 days, the house felt like a normal house. Even that smell had gone. I found Renee humming while cooking. The dogs were now rolling around in the dirt outside, playing. Lily was playing with her toys alone or talking to herself, usually narrating her own actions in third person. not talking to some other entity. That voice in the wall was absent. Cody found me on the line on a Saturday morning. I was on the western side with a brush and a can of paint, as usual, touching up a section that had faded just slightly. I looked up, and he was standing about 10 feet away from me. He was watching me awkwardly. I could tell he'd been there a while. "Why are you painting a circle around the house?" he asked. I started to say something about marking underground utilities or something. The words were halfway up my throat when Cody cut me off. "I saw something standing out here last night." I set the brush across the top of the paint can. "Where did you see it?" He pointed past the line, into the scrub, toward the fence line and the miles of nothing beyond it. "About there, past the red. It was standing still." "Oh, it's nothing, son, just some animal." "It was the size of a person, but it didn't look like a person." He paused, squinting. "The arms were in the wrong spots, or the legs were. It was hard to tell because it was pretty far away. It was standing up, but it looked like it didn't know how to stand up yet. And its head was on sideways. It kept moving its fingers, all of them really fast, the whole time I watched." I stared at him, goosebumps on the back of my neck. He stared back and seemed so calm, in spite of what he saw. "Son, why didn't you wake us up?" "'Cause it was outside the red line. I could tell it couldn't come past it. And I didn't open the window," he said, as if trying to avoid getting in trouble if he had. But that was beyond my concern at this point. I decided to tell him a version of the truth. I told him the previous owner believed something lived on the property, and that the line was how he kept it back. I said I wasn't sure I believed it yet, but the line seemed to help. I then looked him in the eye and told him I needed him to keep his window closed at night and to stay inside the circle. He nodded. Then he said something that gave me a chill. "Dad, Lily isn't talking to the man who lived here before us. She's talking to that thing that lived here with him." He then went back inside. I knelt in the dirt beside my half-painted section and listened to the wind. Renee told me we were leaving on a Wednesday evening after the kids were in bed. She'd been patient, she explained, for longer than I deserved. She tolerated the smell, the moved objects, the dog's behavior, and my increasing preoccupation with the shed and the notebooks and the perimeter. And despite everything getting better, she'd been watching me go outside at 3 a.m. to touch up a section of the line by torchlight, and she was not happy with that. She'd been standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, watching me kneel in the dirt with a paintbrush and a can of Rust-Oleum. She told me this land had changed me, was turning me into something that wasn't her husband. "We're going to Jin's," she said. Jin was her sister in Odessa. "I'm packing tomorrow." "Renee, this is not what I signed up for, David. You're out there painting the ground at 3 a.m. You spend every evening in that shed reading the diaries of a dead man. I saw the kids talking to the freaking walls. I don't care if it's real or if you've lost your mind, because either way, the kids and I are leaving tomorrow, and you're welcome to join us." I tried to explain. I began to tell her about the notebooks and the line, and what happens if the paint fades. She held up her hand, and I went quiet. She didn't want an explanation, at least not one that sounded insane. She wanted a husband, a normal family, and a normal house, and she was completely justified to want that. She was right, but to me at the time, maintaining that line and choosing family were one and the same. In my head, I took a step back and looked at it. I couldn't argue with how insane I looked, and part of me wanted to leave as well. I wanted to put the house and the shed and the line in the rearview mirror and drive to Odessa to sleep with my wife in Jin's guest room and drink some coffee in a kitchen that smelled like normal kitchen. But another, newer part of me felt like I couldn't do that. That I had a responsibility to stay here and maintain the red line. If we left, no one would maintain it. I helped her pack. I packed boxes and loaded the truck, and I told myself we would figure it out from Odessa. Maybe we'd sell the place and take the loss. Maybe someone else would find the notebooks and understand. I knew none of this was true, even while I was thinking it, but I kept packing anyway. We would be leaving in the morning, as she had said. That night, I did a final check of the line at sunset. I walked the perimeter, north side fine, east side fine, south side fine. But then I came to the western section. It was completely gone. The paint had been removed from the ground, scraped away in long strips, and I could see the marks in the dirt where something had dragged across the surface. 4 lines, like the scratches on the doors I found before. I repainted it in the dark. I worked with a torch wedged under my chin and the brush shaking in my hand. I laid down the paint, wet and thick. I could feel something watching me the entire time, from outside the circle, from within the scrub. I didn't see it, but I wasn't trying to find it. But it felt like the darkness out past the scrub had pulled into one spot and taken form. Whatever that feeling was coming from, it was only about 15 feet away. It was not moving and not making a sound. It was like a darkness was at the boundary of the new paint, pressing its face into it like glass. I finished and carefully backed toward the house. That gathered darkness stayed where it was. Inside, Renee was holding Lily in the kitchen. The girl had woke up, talking again, louder than usual. Renee had gone in to check on her, only to hear the other half of the conversation through the wall. The voice that came from within the wall. She couldn't make out the words. She described it as a hum, muffled and distant, but certainly words. She was white. Her hands were trembling. She held Lily against her chest, and Lily was now sleeping, completely asleep, breathing steadily. Thank God for the little things. Renee looked at me and said nothing, but she appeared frightened. I think that was the point where she realized her husband had not lost his mind. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. The clock on the stove read 11:42 p.m. The house ticked and settled around us, and that red line outside, freshly painted, held. We left at dawn. The packing was already done. I loaded the last boxes while Renee strapped the kids into the truck, and the dogs jumped into the bed, immediately pressing themselves flat. Even they looked excited to leave. The sun was just clearing the eastern hills, and the thin light hit the house, making it look so deceptively ordinary, just like it looked the first day. But that fresh red circle now looked insane, which it definitely was. I walked back to the front door, and I stood still for a second before pulling it shut. The house sounded quiet. The hallway was visible and empty where I stood, and it ran straight back to the kitchen. Just a hallway, that 31-foot and 4-inch hallway, drywall and carpet. It was almost beautiful. As I said, I pulled the door closed. I locked it, and I went back to my vehicle with my family, and we drove. Renee sat in the passenger seat with her sunglasses on, not talking, just like she had come in when we first arrived. Cody had his headphones on and Lily was still sleeping. The road out of Sanderson goes north through nothing for a long time, before it meets anything you might call civilization. I watched the house in the rearview mirror, getting smaller, shrinking, including the shed behind it, and from there I could not see the red line anymore. Those 40 acres of land I'd wanted since I was a boy in San Antonio. I was leaving it all behind. We went to Jen's in Odessa. She gave us the guest room and the pull-out couch in the den, not asking too many questions. Jen was the kind of person that knows people sometimes show up, and the questions and answers come later. I had my personal laptop. I had contracts to finish. I sat at Jen's dining table and wrote queries and built database schemas, occasionally answering emails. And at night, I lay in the guest bed next to Renee, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the line, wondering whether the paint was still holding, or if the wind had started to cover it with sand again. 3 weeks passed by. The kids were settling in. Cody started a new school and didn't complain. That boy, I swear. He deals with things on his own and so quietly. He comes to his own conclusions when he's ready. Lily played with Jen's cat and did not mention the sad man, and slept through every night. The color came back to Renee's face again before long. She went back to her old self, cooking full meals instead of heating cans. She and Jen sat on the back patio in the evenings, drinking wine and talking about their mother or their jobs. I sat back and watched my family, happy that it was over and that my obsession with the line was slowly fading. Whatever had been in that house, it was not here. Then I got the notification. My Starlink account sent me an alert that the dish was still drawing power. This was expected. We had left in a hurry, and I hadn't disconnected a thing. But the alert prompted me to check the system status remotely, and the system status showed that my work laptop, which I'd left on the desk in the room I'd been using as an office, was still connected and still awake. I'd left it open and I'd left it on the charger. The Starlink was still feeding it a connection. I remoted in from Jen's dining table at 11 o'clock. Everyone else was in bed. The connection was slow but consistent. The laptop screen appeared on my monitor, that familiar desktop and icons. I was able to view the webcam from there, so I did. The room around the laptop was dark. The webcam showed the desk, the chair, the wall behind it. I could see the edge of the doorway to the hall. The house looked the same. I angled the view using the remote desktop cursor, tilting the laptop screen incrementally, trying to get a wider picture. I could see more of the room. The bookshelf, the window, dark. The ceiling fan, which was motionless. A coffee mug I'd apparently left on the desk was still there, undisturbed. My office chair pushed back from the desk at the angle I'd left it. These ordinary things comforted me for about 2 seconds until I saw the doors. Every door I could see was open. The closet in the office, the door to the hallway, and through the hallway door, I could see the bathroom door on the far side also open, and beyond it, the dark rectangle of the linen closet, gaping. The house had peeled itself open again, every cavity exposed, every threshold breached. The hallway was visible through the doorway, a strip of deeper dark beyond the room's darkness. And at the far end of the hallway, just at the edge of what the webcam's tiny lens could resolve, I saw a shape. It was standing in the hallway. It was the approximate size and height of a man, and he was facing the camera, facing the room. It was standing perfectly still, just the way Cody had described. The image resolution was very low and dark, and I could not see much detail. I could see enough to know that the shape did have a head, and that the head was tilted slightly. It could have been a coat on a hook, or a shadow thrown by the hall light filtering through a window from outside. It could have been pareidolia, the brain's compulsion to find faces and bodies in random visual noise. I kept watching it, waiting for something to happen. And for some time, nothing did. But then, suddenly, the shape moved. It shifted its weight, perhaps adjusting its posture. It leaned forward by some small amount. It was looking at the camera now with what I understood, and a part of my brain was recognition. It knew. It knew I was looking at it through the laptop webcam. I shut the laptop hard enough to nearly break the screen, and I kept both hands pressed on it, like something might burst open from within it at any second. I sat at Jen's dining table in the lamplight, looking around at random things. It sort of grounded me, like when you're a kid and your parents let you watch a scary movie, but they have to turn on cartoons afterward. Jen's normal house kept me sane in that moment. From the den, though, through 2 walls and a closed door, I heard Lily's voice. She was on the pull-out couch. She had been asleep for 3 hours until now, because she was talking to someone. Her voice was quiet, but she sounded as if she was responding to someone's words. I heard a small laugh, followed by an, "Okay?" I sat there listening, and the longer it went on, the more I began to tremble. I put my hands flat on the table, staring at the wood. That red painted circle was calling me now. I felt I had to go back, that I had to drive back to Sanderson, open that shed, read the notebooks again, and ultimately repaint the line, that I would need to repaint it every single morning until the day I died. Then Lily's voice went quiet, and I watched Renee come out of the room Lily was in. I sighed. I had no idea she'd been in there. "You okay?" she asked. I stood up and hugged her so deeply, she was taken aback. "I'm fine." I went to bed with my wife then, and the only thing left on my mind was maybe moving out of Texas for good. Actually, maybe Renee should have the final say this time in where we go next. Haunted houses are scary because sometimes if you stay in them too long, it's not the house that remains haunted, but you and your family end up haunted, no matter where you go next. So be careful whenever you change zip codes. Don't find yourself somewhere with an extra occupant. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Leave Unexplained Encounters a follow and rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. And while you're there, you can find my other podcast if you're in the mood for more scary stories narrated by me. It's called Tales from the Break Room, and it features scary stories that are work-related. By the way, you can read or share your own scary stories over at darkstories.org. Get some EerieCast merch at eeriecast.store. And find me on YouTube at Darkness Prevails. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.